Welcome to 100 Plus, a historical overview of 100 of the most important people, places, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, the Christian faith, and you. In today's podcast, Mike will be focusing on the Great Schism of 1054, which divided the church between the West, the Roman Catholic and Protestant churches, and the East, the capital O, Orthodox churches.
I started the last episode on Christmas Day, 800 AD, when Charlamagne, the king of the Franks, was appointed or was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. So I'm going to stay with that sort of idea, and I'm going to start today's lecture on Easter 1054, when in the Hagia Sophia, this great church initially in Constantinople. It was built in the 6th century. It was this glorious church. When Constantinople fell to the Turks in 453, they converted the Hagia Sophia, not, by the way, to be confused with the Blue Mosque. They're both in Constantinople, both sort of spectacular. The Hagia Sophia built in the 5th century, the 500s in the 6th century, and the Blue Mosque built in the 1600s or the 16th century, one of the two. But anyway, so this is the Hagia Sophia. When it was a church, when the Ottoman Turks overran Constantinople in the 15th century, it became a mosque. Then when Turkey became a secular country, coming just after World War I, before World War II, I think it was 1930s, when it became a secular country, they made it a museum. And it was a museum until just about 4 or 5 months ago, when the president of Turkey, Erdogan, had it reconverted back from being a museum now to being a mosque. So it's a glorious building. I've been there a couple times. You've almost certainly seen pictures of it. Anyway, the event took place at that church, now a mosque. And on Easter morning, 1054, Cardinal Humbert of Silvia Candida was a special envoy of Pope Leo the Ninth. And he went to talk to the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is, so the patriarchs in the Orthodox Church, which is what we're going to talk about, eastern half of the empire. The Orthodox Church doesn't have a pope. They have a handful of patriarchs, sometimes today referred to as Metropolitan. Instead of calling them a pastor, they're called, or a cardinal or a bishop, they're called Metropolitan. So anyway, on Easter morning, they got into a little tiff. And in 1054, it split the church, east and west, and 1,000 years later, it's still split. This is referred to as the Great Schism. So what had happened is that Humbert had stumbled upon some correspondence that had been written by Cyrilius, who was the patriarch of Constantinople, and it was critical of the Western Church. So a leader in the Eastern Church had written something critical of the Western Church, and a leader in the Western Church, a cardinal, Humbert, had stumbled across it. He made a copy. He handwrote a copy. No photocopy machines back then, and took it to the Pope, Pope Leo the Ninth, who instructed Humbert to go back to Constantinople with the letter and to have a conversation and sort of work out their disagreements. So Humbert travels back to Constantinople from Rome, and he goes to speak to this patriarch, Cyrilius. But the conversation gets off to a really bad start when Michael Cyrilius, the patriarch, makes Humbert wait 3 days, which is sort of what diplomats do when they want to show I'm boss, I got more power, I'm going to make you wait for me. This really sets off Humbert. And so when he gets in, he tears into the patriarch, Michael Cyrilius, and lets him have it. And he says in no uncertain terms that the patriarch reports to the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. So the Bishop of Constantinople reports to the Bishop of Rome. This is not the understanding of the other bishops, especially on the eastern side. They saw the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, as being very important, and in fact, ahead of them, more important than them, but not over them. That collectively, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, was sort of first among equals, and but this guy, Humbert, says, no, you actually report to him. His specific statement is that he said, as a hinge remaining unmoved opens and shuts a door, so Peter and his successors in Rome have an unfettered jurisdiction over the whole church, since no one ought to interfere with their positions, for the highest see is judged by no one. By the way, one historian said that Humbert was a particularly cranky guy, tactless and narrow-minded. So he does not take kindly to being to the letter. He doesn't take kindly to being made to wait. So the conversation that they have initially results in a shouting match, and Humbert is going to leave. 2 days later, on Easter morning, he goes into the Hagia Sophia, and he goes up, while the service is going on, he goes up to the altar, and he slaps down a papal bull, excommunicating, supposedly written by Pope Leo IX, although we know that Pope Leo IX had died before this letter was written. So he writes it. Humbert writes it, and he excommunicates the Bishop of Constantinople, this patriarch, Michael Cerullius. And then he marches out of the church, he brushes the dust off of his feet, and he heads back to Rome, thinking perhaps that he had put the Eastern Church in its place. So as soon as he gets back, he discovers that in sort of retaliation, that the Bishop of Constantinople, this patriarch, Michael Cerullius, had returned the favor. He had excommunicated Humbert, and he had excommunicated the Pope, even though the Pope is now dead. Now, no one really thought that much of it at the time. I mean, it was ugly. It was a bad day. But no one thought that 1,000 years later, the church would still be split. But what happens is that there's going to be some other events. There's efforts to sort of get the churches back together again, but the Crusades are going to kick in. And during one of the Crusades, tragically, so much about the Crusades is obviously tragic, but during one of the Crusades, a group heading out of Rome to head to Jerusalem somehow turns the other direction and goes up to Constantinople. So the church and loots Constantinople. First time the city of Constantinople has been looted in hundreds of years. And these Christians from the west go after the Christians in the east, and lots of people are killed, and it's just, that becomes something particularly difficult to get over. And so we have this division, the Great Schism, 1054, between the church in the west and the church in the east. So let me just come right out and say, this is one of the episodes, and there will be others, where you are particularly disappointed in the church. We really want the church to be better than it is, and we want the church to be better than it was. The truth is, the church is a collection of broken people, just like me, just like you. We've been called out by Christ. We've been redeemed by Christ. But we are not fully sanctified. And there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in the church. This should not surprise us, especially if we read the book of Acts and we see all the problems that are going on there. But it disappoints us all the same. And so I just want to say, as we're going through this big survey, 2,000 years, the most significant people, ideas, and events in the church over the course of the last 2,000 years, I am not shying away from those that are particularly painful, those that are unjustifiable. I don't want us to deny our past. I want to call them out. I want to bring them into the light of day. I want us to look at them. Denying our mistakes, or worse yet, trying to cover them up, is a bad plan. The mistakes themselves can be bad, but sometimes the mistakes are understandable in light of passions or circumstances or other things. You go, yeah, that's unfortunate, but I can understand it. But the cover-up that's done in sort of the cold, objective reality when you should be able to distance yourself, you should have time to reflect on this and say, okay, we've got to make this right. The cover-up can often be a far more serious offense. So I'm gonna highlight the bad notes, and so we're coming into a handful of them that come here in the High Middle Ages. I think that the church is better than you do, and I suspect that I think the church is worse than you think it is. So I want to celebrate all the good things that the church does, and many of them are being covered up. I don't want them to be covered up. I want the truth to be out, but I think that if we get to celebrate our wins and we get to celebrate the good things that are done, we also have to own up to the bad things that are done. So this is, by the way, I also think it's best if you hear the bad things from a friend. Nothing is worse than being a college student who grows up in a Christian home and maybe even goes to a Christian high school and is not told about all the things that the church did wrong. And so the first time you hear it is in a philosophy class or a world civ class or something like that. So these can be discouraging, but I think it's best if we hear them from inside, from teammates. So, by way of review, to sort of set this whole event and the Great Schism in context. In the last episode, I did a flyover of the early Middle Ages, which run from 476, when the last emperor of the Roman Empire in the West is deposed, 476, to 1000 AD. And we noted that during this time, there was the rise of feudalism, that the church moved into the void that was created by the collapse of the Roman Empire. Talked about the way icons became important and then divisive. Talked about the formation of the church calendar. Talked about the challenges that grew out of the fact that you got the Vikings coming down, marauding and pillaging. And then also talked then specifically about the Carolingian Renaissance that came under Charlamagne. And in this episode, I want to go into the next part of the Middle Ages. So Middle Ages have three sections: early Middle Ages, High Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. And the High Middle Ages run from about 1000 to about 1300. Again, one day is not early Middle Ages and the next day is High Middle Ages, right? I mean, these are cultural tectonic plates shifting over time. But the High Middle Ages are filled with some very significant events. Some of them are bad. As I mentioned, you've got the Great Schism, which we're going to focus on. You've also got the Crusades, which are coming up in episode 24. This is episode 22. You've also got the Black Plague, and I mentioned that last time. So again, as of today, as I'm filming this, I heard that we're still basically around 0.1% of the United States dying because of the COVID pandemic, which is tragic. 375,000, trending towards 400,000 people. So in context, when the Black Plague hit, it wasn't 0.1% of the people dying, it was 50 to 60% of the people dying. So it wasn't 1 in 1,000, it was 6 in 10. And it was somewhere close to 100, maybe some would say 200 million people dying. So that is going to happen during the High Middle Ages. Now, in addition to there being rough moments, there were really good things that happened during the High Middle Ages. This is when higher education sort of gets launched. Gothic architecture is going to come into being, and a lot of the great cathedrals that are still standing were built then. Intellectual advances are going to pave the way to set up for the scientific revolution that will follow. You can argue that capitalism takes some big steps forward here. This is also where some important political events are happening, including the formation of the Magna Carta. And then there's just, in addition to the bad things and the good things, there's just a lot of things that are going to happen. The donation of Constantine, the condemnation of 1277, scholasticism, which is coming up in a few lectures when we hit Anselm. All of that are things that are happening. And then you've also got, as I mentioned, King Arthur and the Round Table, which, okay, he wasn't a real person, sort of like Robin Hood, but this is where all this is set and where all the Arthurian legends go back to. So, our focus today is on the Great Schism. And I've been referencing this for a while now. Not all of the 100 events that I'm sort of drawing attention to are of equal importance. Some are much more significant than others. This one has a really big impact. So I've been noting that there was this growing tension between the East and the West. So the East is centered out of Rome. The West is centered out of Rome, generally referred to as the West, or also we've got the Western Church, we've got the Latin Church, eventually it'll be called the Roman Catholic Church. So that's all in the West. The East is based out of Constantinople. It's called the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Church. Occasionally it gets referred to as like the Greek Orthodox Church, which is not accurate because there's a Russian Orthodox Church, Ethiopian Orthodox Church. There's all kinds of ethnic Orthodox churches. So many people today talk about the Greek, and that's in part, I think, because the eastern half of the empire was writing in Greek, as opposed to the western half of the empire that was more writing in Latin. But anyway, today, as of today, there are three major branches of the church. There is the Roman Catholic Church, 1.5 billion members. There is a second Western church, the Protestant Church. This is what breaks away in the 16th century from the Roman Catholic Church. This is when Luther, this is the 95 Theses, Wittenberg Door, all that. We'll look at this at some detail coming up down the line. But there are 800 million Protestants. They were protesters. That's where the word Protestant comes from. So they were protesting what they saw of as the abuses, as the mistakes in the Roman Catholic Church. And they wanted to go back in time. They thought that during the Middle Ages, the church in the West loses its way. And with the rise of the papacy and some corruption that we're going to see coming in, especially in the 10th century and then later, they want to see a reformation. They are protesting what they see to be abuses in the Western church. So, and by the way, the Protestant churches don't ever sort of unify. So you've got all kinds of Protestant churches. You've got high Protestant churches like Anglicans, and you've got mainline Protestant churches, the Methodists and the Lutherans and the Presbyterians. And then you've got lower Protestant churches, so Baptist churches or non-denominational churches. You've also got Pentecostal churches. All of these come under this rubric of the Protestant church. Well, in addition to these two, you have a third group, and this is the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox, I'll refer to it as the capital O Orthodox Church, to distinguish it from a church that is Orthodox, as in a good church, Orthodox as opposed to heretical. So the capital O Orthodox Church, there are 250 million Orthodox Christians. And again, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ethiopian, Latvian, you've got all these different Orthodox churches. They're easy to identify when you see the clergy because they all tend to have the long beards and they wear dark robes and big hats. In a lecture I was listening to by a church history lecture by Ryan Reeves, who's a professor, Cambridge PhD in church history and a professor at Gordon Conwell. And I was listening to his lecture on the Great Schism, and he said that many people in America, all they know about the Orthodox Church is what they saw on a Seinfeld episode, where George is trying to convert and become Latvian Orthodox because his girlfriend's parents aren't accepting him because he's not a member of the church. And so I didn't see that Seinfeld episode, but I Googled part of it, and it's all about the hats. Yeah, when asked by the priest why he wants to join the Latvian Orthodox Church, what he likes most about it, and these guys, dark robes and big hats and big white beards, he goes, he really likes the hats. So, if you know more about the Orthodox Church, you might know that just recently, like in the last couple of weeks, there is no pope in the Orthodox Church, but there are these patriarchs, there are the bishops of these various churches, the Russian church, and so the Metropolitan Philae, the Metropolitan of Constantinople, of Serbia, just passed away. He was a leading figure. He died at the age of 82 of COVID. Controversial guy in Serbia because he helped bring down the government. But very effective as a church leader. When he became the bishop, there were like 19 priests in Montenegro, and when he was leading, there were 1,200. So anyway, he passed away. You may know. You may also know, if you know something about the Orthodox churches, that they tend to be in countries where the church is often persecuted, and so that's of concern to us. And there's often a lot of tension, in particular between the Orthodox churches and the Protestant missionaries. And so this can be very challenging to sort of sort through. Well, enough about all that. Our focus, again, is on the fact that the church split, which is egregious. When you read John 17, when you see how much Jesus prioritizes the unity of the church, this is a challenge. And in order to understand all the things that were leading up to it, because the tiff that happened between Humbert and Cyrilius is not really the reason the church split. It was just sort of the catalytic moment that all these other things happened. So, if you've been paying attention over the previous 20-some lectures, you know that the empire had both a western and an eastern half, and that they started to drift apart. They were together under Constantine, but they're so sprawling and communication is so challenging that they begin to drift apart. You also have picked up that we don't have the separation of church and state back then that we have in this country today. So consequently, as these big, vast parts of the empire are drifting apart, because they have different cultures and different languages and all different challenges, different enemies, all these different things, and poor communication. As the empires drift apart, the churches begin to drift apart. And all of this is leading up to, all these challenges are leading up to this Great Schism. Now, I'm going to add one more to what's going on. So, as we head into the 11th century, the papacy, so the power of the Bishop of Rome as Pope, the papacy is gaining political power. And I'm going to explain more about all the reasons for that coming up in the next episode. The Cliff's Notes version of this, and I'll say the Cliff Notes. It's actually not Cliff Notes, it's Cliff's Notes, but nobody knows that, so I sound like an idiot. I was corrected once, and I'm now torn. Do I say it right and make you think I'm an idiot, or do I say it wrong and you don't hear it? But the shorthand of all of this is that during the 10th century, the papacy is languishing. There's lots of problems. There's growing stagnation. There's corruption. And as we go into the 11th century, some of the reforms are beginning to be put in place. So we're going to look at the Cluniac reform that comes and some other things. But there's some good things that begin to happen. This positions the Bishop of Rome, and you've got a strong pope at a certain point, who pushes back on the challenges of investiture. So one of the ways that the Bishop of Rome gains power is to claim that he, and he alone, has the ability to appoint bishops of other areas. Kings had been doing this. And for that matter, the Pope had been selected by certain political families. And so this bishop is going to come along, Gregory, and he is going to demand, he's going to get, for a variety of reasons, the power of investiture, and he is going to have the Pope to be elected by cardinals. So as he's gaining power, one of the things that this allows him to do is to not be involved in all the sort of petty street politics that are going on around him. He's able to sort of raise his head and look out, and part of what he sees is what's going on in the East. And so he begins to challenge what is going on in the East and to try and assert some of his authority there. So as it turns out, the East doesn't really welcome this because you've got all these differences. You've got political differences, you've got cultural differences, you've got language differences, you've got some theological differences in terms of whether, again, this is an episode that you're sort of embarrassed by the church. They're fighting over whether the communion bread should be leavened or unleavened. There's disagreements over whether or not clergy can be married or not. There's just differences in governance style, how centralized it is, how much control is going back to one person as opposed to going back to committees. And then you have this flashpoint of Humbert intercepting this letter where the East is criticizing the West, and then he gets in this spitting match with the patriarch. So when you read all this stuff, and I'm obviously in preparation for these lectures, I'm sort of going back and reading it, you sort of come away amazed that they haven't split like 500 years before this. And the other thing that becomes obvious is that the big fight for all the other things that they will point to, icons and the Filioque Clause and all of that, all the other things they point to, the big fight is over whether or not the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, has control over Constantinople. And the churches in the East say, no, that's not the way it was set up. That's not the way we've been operating. That's not the way the church operated the first 300-400 years. And in Rome, they say, no, it is, and that's the way it's going to be. There were other things besides the primacy of the Pope. There's sort of different approach to icons, which I talked about in the past. There's also something called the Filioque Clause, which, so in the Council of Nicaea, we got to back all the way up, or maybe it's Council of Constantinople, but one of the very first councils, there's a statement about the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father. At some point later on, the Western Church, okay, so we're part of the Western Church, it adds this line, it's just filioque, so filio, son, and qui, and from, in Latin. So they add this line, the Filioque Clause, that says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son. And so the Western Church did this because they were fighting Arianism, and they argued that it was theologically correct. But the Eastern Church, this isn't what they had agreed upon. And the Eastern Church doesn't really know that the Western Church has added this. They sort of start to pick up on it in the 6th century. They really pick up on it in the 7th century, and they cry foul. First of all, the Eastern Church, in the Western Church, we would look at the Trinity and say, one God in three persons. The Eastern Church sort of goes, three persons in one God. It's just coming at the Trinity from different perspectives. That we're sort of emphasizing the unity. They're sort of emphasizing within the unity the diversity. and they don't have the Arian challenge, which is sort of course, demeaning. This is Arius, the idea that Jesus is the vice president of heaven, but not fully equal with God the Father. So this is a big deal, and it remains a big deal. There I saw a picture of a protest not too long ago. The Pope and the Bishop of Constantinople, I believe, were getting together, and there in the background, somebody holding up a sign, protesting, "Drop the filioque," theological trash talking at a sort of not at a high level. Lots of people know about this controversy. But interestingly, when the two of them got together and there was a movement in the 1200s and a movement in the 1400s to try and get the churches back together, and they ultimately failed. They couldn't get there. In Vatican II, there was after Vatican II, there was more effort. And not too long ago, in church terms, 15 years ago, they got together for the first time and had a meeting and had communion together. And they said the Nicene Creed. So the big question was, how are they going to say it? So they did not include the filioque clause. And the agreement that whether this still holds or not, that the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church have, is that when together they will not include the filioque clause, but when separate, the Catholic Church will add it back in. So there were some other issues that were providing sideways noise to this, but the real issue was over whether or not the Pope had preeminent power. And what happens when it comes to the Hagia Sophia, that event on Easter, that's just sort of the flashpoint that led to the Great Schism. And so it's a challenge. It remains a challenge. Church unity is always a challenge. And of course there are, I talk about fence posts. There are a handful of things that we say we absolutely go to the mat over, that we fight over. There are articles in our statement of faith that we say, no, we're very specific in terms of what we say. And we try not to have many articles. Some churches have lots and lots and lots of them, and everybody has to believe the same thing about everything. And I would say no, there's a handful of things that we actually fight over, and others we're going to say are secondary issues, and we're going to just only going to speak well of each other, but say we disagree on some of these points. So this is a big deal, and what happens on Easter Day is you've got this tiff, and then later on it gets formalized. And so on July 16th, 1054, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, as the Nicene Creed had stated, it splits, and there are two. There is a Roman Catholic Church, and there is an Orthodox Church. And they will cooperate and do some things together, especially as the Muslims move in the East. The Eastern Church will reach out to the West looking for some help and some support. So let me wrap this up with just a couple other observations. Because of the split, the Eastern Church does not go through the Middle Ages. It does not go through the Renaissance. It does not go through the Reformation. It does not go through the Enlightenment. And some would argue that has led the Eastern Church to be frozen in time. Clearly, when you look at the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and the Protestant Church, you see that they are reacting to culture and some of these issues very differently. The Catholic Church is pretty rooted in tradition, but not nearly as much as the Orthodox Church is. Protestant churches, which again are independent often of each other, Protestant churches tend to take different approaches. So my shorthand description of this would be mainline churches have tended to lock in a little bit more on the form, on the liturgy, on the structure, on the look, and a little bit less on the content than more evangelical churches. good grief, after this week, that's a particularly bad word. That's complicated as well. Many evangelicals, politically, people who identify themselves as evangelicals, haven't been to church in the last 2 years. And those who are active in churches tend to have very different political views than those who are not. It's all complicated, but let me just say the different ways that churches, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox, have interacted with culture are notable, and the Orthodox Church seems to be a bit frozen in time. It is worth noting, and we will talk more about this next time, that the church, any church, has problems with power. Lord Acton's dictum that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is pretty obvious. And we're going to see this playing out as the church, as the Catholic Church moves through the 10th century. There's reform efforts in the 11th century, but as it continues in the 12th and 13th century, there's some real challenges. And it's not just Protestants that would say this. Again, it's very hard to talk objectively about the Catholic Church because you're making a call one way or the other on this. And it's not so much a historical debate as it is a theological set of assumptions about how things ought to play out. But given that the Catholic Church will have a counter-reformation and will acknowledge a lot of the corruption that has come into it, I think it's safe to say that we see some of the real challenges as the church is filling in more and more of the gap that is left by the Roman Empire having, somewhat collapsed. And it gets political power. That just tends to cause problems. A third comment that I'll say is that we can learn from the Orthodox Church. I feel like, as a Protestant, as a pastor, I certainly can learn from some of the ways the Orthodox Church interacts with mystery and beauty. I do have one icon. I bought an icon as a show and tell when I'm giving lectures. I don't use icons as prayer aids. I don't venerate them. I'm a little standoffish. I'm a little troubled by icons. But I love some of the mystery, and I love sort of the Eastern approach to some of these things. Westerners tend to be very rational, and at some point at the expense of beauty and love and mystery and some of these things. So one of the things that I have appreciated in the last 5 years is the Jesus prayer that comes out of the Orthodox Church. And it's very short. It's, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And it's not, it's more of, and if you listen and you read the Eastern Church talking about this, it's less the words than it is sort of a meditation or a position that you take. And I have found it to be helpful. So the Great Schism it's always a tragedy, it's almost always a tragedy when things split up. When the church splits up like this. So the Great Schism, 1054, has a big impact on the church down through today, and we are going to come back and think a little bit more about this as we move further into the High Middle Ages and we take on scholasticism, so we'll be going back and looking a little bit at Aristotle, Anselm. That's coming up in the next podcast, number 23. See you then.